You are listening to Retirement Lifestyle Advocates Radio. I'm your host, Dennis Tubbergen. Glad you're listening in today. Hey, joining me on today's program, if you are a longtime listener, I know you'll recognize his name. Mr. Ian Gordon of the Longwave Group will be joining me in segments 2 and 3 of today's program. If you're a new listener, be sure to stay tuned. Ian has, approaching probably 50 years of experience researching monetary policy and economic cycles, and I know you're going to appreciate his perspective. And if you're a new listener also here at RLA Radio, we are all about offering you a different perspective, a perspective that you may not hear anywhere else, and we're all about education. And we do have some resources, free resources for our listeners to access if you are so inclined. You can go to the website, retirementlifestyleadvocates.com. That's retirementlifestyleadvocates.com, and you can download the podcast version of any of our programs there. You can also, if you would like, subscribe to our weekly market update newsletter. It's called Portfolio Watch. It is delivered every Monday at 5 p.m., right after market close. And we also have another site that you can visit if you'd like to check out one of our local educational events. Each month we do an educational event that may help you maximize the benefits that you get from Social Security, may give you some strategies and tactics that you can use to save taxes over the long run on your IRA or 401k. And we also talk about what's going on in the economy and threats to your retirement and things that you may think about doing to protect yourself. So those meetings also offer not only some specific hands-on strategies for you to consider, but also some valuable perspective. Now, speaking of perspective, in this segment I want to talk a bit about central bank policies. As many of you know, if you've been a long-time listener, and if I want to exercise full disclosure here, truth be told, I am fundamentally opposed to private bankers controlling monetary policy, which is the case worldwide today. The Federal Reserve, which is the central bank of the United States, is controlled by central bankers. It's a group of private bankers. See, back in 1913, then President Woodrow Wilson, in December of 1913, just as Congress was breaking for their winter break, their Christmas break, he signed into law something called the Federal Reserve Act. The Federal Reserve Act made the Federal Reserve, this private group of bankers, the group that would be in charge of monetary policy. Now, whenever you put private bankers in charge of monetary policy, which incidentally has been tried many, many times throughout history, history teaches us that it never works in the long term. And of course, I need to digress here because you probably remember what your history teacher or history professor told you. Those who don't study history are doomed to repeat it. Well, history teaches us that putting private bankers in charge of monetary policy just doesn't work. In fact, to think that private bankers are putting the interest of the public ahead of their own interests is really unrealistic. In fact, many folks who hear this don't realize the impact that it may have on them and their investments and their future, but we'll get into that in more detail with Ian Gordon in the next couple segments. Now, beating up on central banks is never politically popular, at least in some circles. There are some political candidates in this current election cycle that will tell you that, and there have been other politicians that have been critical of Federal Reserve policies. In fact, one of them, former presidential candidate Ron Paul, has been a guest here on this program, and he will tell you that criticizing Federal Reserve policy or central bank policy sometimes is not politically effective. Now, to criticize central bankers and be skeptical as to whether or not we want private bankers in control of monetary policy is nothing new. We can go all the way back and look at what Thomas Jefferson had to say about it. Thomas Jefferson understood this well, and he had a lot to say on the topic. In fact, one of his quotes, which is now becoming more famous due to present monetary policy, rings very true. Here is what Mr. Jefferson had to say. If the American people ever allow private bankers to control the issue of their currency, first through inflation, then through deflation, the banks and corporations that will grow up around them will deprive the people of all property until they wake up homeless on the continent their fathers conquered. Then there's this one, also attributable to Mr. Jefferson. He said this, I sincerely believe that banking establishments are more dangerous than standing armies, and that the principle of spending money to be paid by posterity under the name of funding is but swindling futurity on a large scale. Now, maybe to put that quote in more modern language, Mr. Jefferson is saying that banking establishments are more dangerous than the military, and if you're spending money today and having your kids pay for it tomorrow, you're stealing from them. Now, here is a bit more perspective for you. Central banks controlled by private bankers really exist in nearly every economy today. And they still enjoy a fair amount of believability worldwide, but I believe the day is soon coming when central bankers will be recognized as the cause of the problem rather than the solution to all things economic. Now, a gentleman by the name of Francisco Brunamonte, who was writing for the Mises Institute, had this to say recently in an article that he published titled, Central Banks Are Just Getting Warmed Up. And I'm going to give you just a bit from that article. According to all central banks, one of the main problems they are called to solve is that countries cannot reach their inflation target of 2%. Even their religious trust in the long discredited Phillips curve cannot explain why price inflation is low in many countries despite historically low unemployment rates. Now, if you're not familiar with the Phillips curve, in which Mr. Brunamonte states that central bankers have a religious trust, the Phillips curve just theorizes that the relationship between unemployment and inflation is inverse. In other words, when unemployment is low, inflation is high, and when unemployment is high, inflation is low. Now, the Phillips curve was first discussed by its developer, who, not surprisingly, had the last name of Phillips, Bill Phillips to be precise. This was discussed in 1958, and when Mr. Phillips developed this theory, he studied 100 years of wage inflation and unemployment in the UK. Now, his theory was embraced by some and rejected by others, including Milton Friedman, who was a pretty well-respected economist. Now, Mr. Friedman argued that wages would automatically adjust to the market on an inflation-adjusted basis. And given that the official unemployment rate is very low, as is the official inflation rate, that would seem to make the case for Mr. Friedman's argument. Yet these central bankers embrace this strategy. Now, I'm going to talk more about this in the last segment and what it might mean for you, but here's the bottom line. Whenever money is created, whether you call it quantitative easing or whatever you call it, it's got to go somewhere. History tells us that it goes typically into stocks and now into bonds. If you think about the investments that you have in your IRA or 401k, they're probably stock and bond based. So there's a good chance, in my view, that these assets are overvalued and due for a correction. If you're close to retirement, you want to make sure that you're ready for that. There are resources available at retirementlifestyleadvocates.com for you to check out. You could also check out our events at www.socialsecuritydinner.com. I'll be back with Mr. Ian Gordon. Welcome back to RLA Radio. I'm your host, Dennis Tubbergen. On the phone with me today, joining me from his home in Canada, is Mr. Ian Gordon. And for those of you that have been longtime listeners of the program, Ian has, I think he first appeared on one of the radio programs that I hosted maybe 10 or 12 years ago. Ian might have a better idea. Ian has really sparked my interest and been a mentor in a lot of ways when it comes to motivating me to study macroeconomic history, fiat currencies, and gold. So whenever I get a chance to talk to Ian, I'm always glad to do that. In fact, before we started recording the interview today, I think we chatted for about 20 minutes. Ian has his website that you can go visit. There's a lot of writings, information, and research there. The website is thelongwavegroup.com. These days, I think Ian does a lot of researching and reading, but you're really enjoying life on a big piece of property in a remote area of British Columbia, I think, Ian, would be fair to say. So welcome back to the program. Glad you're here.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
Well, Ian, let's start for our listeners maybe that aren't familiar with a lot of the work that you've done over the years. I think there's an old saying, I think it was King Solomon who wrote that there's nothing new under the sun. And we today are seeing this epidemic, to use that term, of money creation, of just creating fiat currencies. But through a lot of your work, there are some nuances and some variations on a theme, but certainly this has been going on throughout history. Can you comment a little bit about, maybe a couple of historical examples of when money printing has occurred and what the inevitable outcome ultimately will be?
Well, I think, for your listeners, it's very important to understand that we're now, in a paper money system where money is created out of nothing, and essentially so that the value of the money is completely is eroding all the time. As more and more of this money is created, the value of the money is actually being eroded. And one of the best ways to measure this, and for a long time when I was writing, I said the most important chart that people could ever look at would be the Dow-Gold ratio chart. And I know now Bill Bonner is talking a lot about the Dow-Gold ratio chart. What this chart is it's the measure of the value of the Dow Jones Industrial Average versus the value of an ounce of gold. And that chart, I basically mapped it into my Longwave work and showed that the value has the ups and downs throughout the Longwave. When paper, the Dow Jones Industrial Averages are the measurement of paper values of stocks versus the gold values. Sometimes the value of stocks is far stronger than the value of gold, and other times during the cycle, the value of gold is far stronger than the value of paper. For instance, if we look at the current Longwave, which I would say, I divided it into the 4 seasons of the year, and the Longwave is about 60, 70 years long. It was initially sort of developed by Nikolai Kondratiev, a Russian economist, in the 1920s, and I effectively used his work and then enlarged on his work to develop my own work on the subject. So that the spring, which is the beginning of each cycle, is the rebirth of the economy. It occurs in the spring, just as it does. It's the rebirth of nature, really, in our own world. It happens in the spring. The trees start to bud and flower. The flowers start to produce, and so on. And that's very good for the economy. So that stocks do very well in the spring, and the value of the Dow Jones increases quite dramatically during the spring as the economy performs and grows. Then you come into the summer of the economy, which in our cycle started in 1966. And always has been the inflationary period of the cycle. And therefore, the stocks don't really perform versus inflation. And gold really does perform. So gold goes from $35 an ounce at the beginning of the summer cycle, 1966, to $850 in 1980. And the ratio at the end in 1980, the value of the Dow versus an ounce of gold is actually 1-to-1. So you get an extreme low relationship, gold to stocks. Then in the autumn, that's always the biggest bull market in gold, stocks, and real estate. And that occurred between 1980, 81, and 2000. And the stocks outperformed down. They went from sort of 800 on the Dow all the way up to, I think it was 16,000. But anyway, the ratio, the Dow gold ratio, it takes 44 ounces of gold to buy the Dow in July 1999. And since then, that's been the peak. And since then, gold has been outperforming the stocks. Now, that doesn't mean every day that gold's going to do better than the stock market, but relative. So that today we're at about 16-to-1 from 44-to-1. So we're going down to an extreme low ratio where the gold is going to outperform stocks. So the bear market in stocks that started in 2000 and again in 2007 has been effectively negated by a massive money printing process, that creation of paper money. For instance, in 2008, I think the Federal Reserve created something like $20 trillion to negate the real crisis in the banking system. So we're now going into a period where gold is going to outperform the stock market, and eventually this performance is going to be very evident because stocks are being held at a very high level simply through the money printing process. And when this happens, the stock market will crash like it did after 1929. I could envisage, a 90% drop in stock values as they did between 1929 and 1932. And gold will go to a ratio at least of 1-to-1, and perhaps, I've always said, it may go to 1/4-to-1. So we're going to see the value, a quarter of an ounce of gold will buy the Dow Jones Industrials. It's going to be a very, very extreme low ratio anyway. And gold is the far better place to be in at this period in time in the cycle than in the stock market.
Ian, if we go back and study history and take a look, for example, at when Weimar Germany printed money after World War I, when John Law printed money in France in the early 1700s, I mean, aren't we headed for a predictable outcome here?
Well, I would say it's certainly predictable, and it's certainly predictable that the money system is going to collapse. Again, if we go back to the Longwave system, whenever you create paper money ad infinitum, which is what is happening at this stage in the cycle, effectively since 1971, when Nixon took the United States off gold. Whenever you create paper money, out of nothing, which is what is happening today. I mean, most people don't realize if you get a mortgage, the bank creates the money to pay that mortgage. There was no money. They just credit your account with the amount of mortgage that you have to pay the vendor, and that money's being created from nothing. And the same, if you go and get a car loan, the money's created from nothing. It's just added to the money system. And this is what's happening with paper money. And this is what really happened in Germany, so that eventually the German the currencies, effectively, it was something like, and I've got these German marks and so on, that, it was millions of marks issued, and children used them as building blocks for houses and so on, all the money, and they used them because the people were so poor. They used the money to effectively to burn the money. Whatever money got paid, and Germans were paid twice a day. They had to carry the payment back in wheelbarrows because of the massive creation of the German currency. And so we're very close to this period now where the whole money system, the world money system, is going to break down, and with it we're going to have, effectively that means you're going to have a massive inflation occurring because the value of your money is going to be worthless, as it was in Germany. So, and the same, in Venezuela. You look at the stock market. The stock market is, in Venezuelan bolivars has done extremely, is extremely high, but the bolivar is worthless. So it really doesn't matter that the stock market values are high in bolivars. They're not high in dollars, or certainly not high in gold.
And Ian, I did a piece a while ago for some clients, and I think these numbers are right, but I'm in the ballpark anyway, so full disclosure here, I haven't researched this before our conversation, but I believe an ounce of gold priced in German marks in 1919 was about 170 marks, and then by November of 1923, when the mark had been devalued by a factor of 29 billion, gold had actually increased priced in German marks by a factor of 87 billion. So you would have actually increased your wealth by 300% during that time frame had you had gold. So there's certainly a lesson there. And would you agree then that tangible assets like gold and silver and maybe some other tangible assets certainly should be part of everybody's portfolio?
Well, absolutely. I mean, to me, when you're looking at things like the Dow-gold ratio, which is effectively a paper versus gold value, gold has outperformed paper for a very, very, very long time, effectively since 1971. When it was $35 an ounce when Nixon went off the gold standard. So it's outperformed paper because they've created so much paper that the value of currencies has been diminished considerably. I mean, I was talking to you, Dennis, about buying a house. My wife and I bought a house in Winnipeg in 1968 for $15,000 in a good area of Winnipeg. It's called River Heights, and I went back and I looked at the value of those same houses in River Heights on the same street, and they're over $300,000 today. Well, the house hasn't changed. It may have been painted or whatever, but it hasn't effectively changed. And the value is not the value that the house has increased in value from 15 to 300,000. It's the fact that the paper has decreased so much in value, and gold has increased considerably in value. So when the paper money system crashes, and I believe that we're extremely close to this system coming apart, the gold and silver will become sort of the premier the currencies that people will turn to because they can't trust paper anymore. They won't trust paper as they did not trust paper money in Germany in 22-23.
Well, the clock tells me that we're going to have to end it there for this segment. My guest today on the program is Mr. Ian Gordon. You can read his just wealth of work at the longwavegroup.com. I'd encourage you to do that. And the good news is that Ian will be back for another segment, which will continue right after these words. So I'd encourage you to stay with us. You are listening to RLA Radio. I'm your host, Dennis Tubbergen. My guest today is Mr. Ian Gordon. Ian's been a friend for a long time. Ian is a frequent guest, or has been a frequent guest on the program. I'm a big fan of his life work, if you will, which you can learn more about at the longwavegroup.com. I'd encourage you to do that. And I'm going to jump right in, Ian, because it seems that whenever we start chatting, 12 minutes goes by in a big hurry. So let's in the last segment we talked about literally money creation, and I live in a very rural area north of Grand Rapids, Michigan, and there we have a saying that if you put perfume on a pig, it's still a pig, and if you call money printing something other than money printing, it's still money printing. So let's just examine what's going on in the repo market now. And for our listeners that might not be familiar with that, the repo market is really the market where banks lend each other money overnight short term. And Ian, there's been some crazy stuff going on there. The Fed is really injecting money, newly created money into the banking system to keep things rolling. What do you read into this, and what's your comment?
Well, it tells us the fact that they're putting in 60 billion, 100 billion, a night. It means that there's obviously some sort of crisis where banks, the interbank lending that the repo market is not, banks are not lending to other banks as they normally would in the overnight market, and so the Fed has to step in and bring in that money. It indicates, a lack of confidence with regards to the banks, to the credit worthiness of other banks within the system, so that the Fed basically has to come in and look after the issues so that these banks can get money. Now, we don't know which banks this is. We have no idea what the banks, but it means that there is a problem, and it reminds me very much of the beginnings of the problem, 2007. I wrote a piece, and it's on my website still, called "This Is It," where I forecast that the whole banking system would collapse, and it effectively did collapse, but had to be bailed out by the Fed in 2007. I published a piece. So it reminds me very much of that period in time where, the Federal Reserve is having to step in to sort of shore up some banks. We don't know which banks they are. It could be Deutsche Bank, and it doesn't have to be American banks. It could be German banks. I mean, the Fed bailed out a lot of European banks in 2008. So we don't know where it is, but it means that there's a major, major problem within the banking system.
Do you think, Ian, that the Fed is in a position, given how big this problem could be? I mean, when you look at the derivative exposure of these big banks, when you just look at the numbers associated with this, does the Fed have enough bullets in the gun to be able to, pull a rabbit out of the hat one more time, or will this finally be the deflationary event that a lot of us have been anticipating?
Well, I don't believe that it does, because ultimately everything is revolves around confidence, and the fact is that confidence was almost lost in 2008. And it took something like over $20 trillion of money printing. $20 trillion of money printing. It's an absolutely unimaginable amount of money that's being created to save the system at that time. Well, at this time, particularly when you start to look at the derivatives that are associated, most of the derivatives are credit derivatives. And a derivative is simply, there's a buyer and a seller. So there's one long and one short in the derivatives market. So if one can't basically honor its obligations, it takes down the other. And we're talking multi trillions of dollars. And most people really don't understand what a trillion is. And I have to admit that I couldn't measure it, but it's so unimaginably large. It wasn't a number until fairly recently, because it was just so big. And the point is that the derivatives market, to try and bail out derivatives, the derivatives exposure, and you can take bank like Deutsche Bank, I think its exposure is something like $40 trillion. Well, it's so enormous that the Fed it would be impossible for the Fed to bail it out, because the dollar would be basically, get hammered in terms of its value. So I just don't know, when the system starts to collapse, how they're going to basically put the thing together again. And I'm fairly confident that once the system collapses, the whole economy will collapse because the paper money system will collapse. People don't realize how serious it's going to be. It means that, everything works on credit in our economy. It's 30 days, generally 30 days credit. The trucks deliver stuff to the grocery stores. They're paid in 30 days. The farmers that harvest the produce, they're paid, in 30 days. Everything is based on credit. When the system collapses, the credit system collapses, and there's no money available. So eventually, the economy just basically ceases to function. It can't function without the money, and the money is worthless. It's just like in Paris, in John Law's time, and again in the late 1800s, the farmers refused to deliver grain to Paris because they were being paid in paper money, and the value of paper money was worthless. So effectively, people in Paris were starving, and that's really what brought about the French Revolution. And I think it was Marie Antoinette was credited with the thing that, when she was told they couldn't get any bread, the peasants couldn't get bread in Paris, she said, well, let them eat cake. And she suffered the guillotine for that. But the thing is, the whole system, when it collapses, the whole economy will collapse, and the availability of the economy to function will cease to exist. There will be no groceries in grocery stores. There will be no gas in the gas stations. That just won't happen. The whole system is going to fall apart.
Well, and if you look, Ian, at what happened in Weimar, Germany, and you can correct me if my dates are off or my months are off, but as I recall, the mark failed in September, and it was November before commerce started again, and they put the Rentenmark in place, which is a story in and of itself. But there was 60 days there that basically commerce just basically stopped because there was no way to conduct any kind of commerce. And I'm sure the same thing may have happened in John Law's France, and whenever a currency is devalued to the point that confidence is lost. So do you have any thoughts on the fact that the U.S. dollar is still the world reserve currency, that may delay the day of reckoning?
No, I don't think so. I think, the fact is that, it's purely a fiat currency. Yes, it is. It's already losing that reserve status. I mean, things like oil sales that used to be, all done in dollars are being done in other currencies now. The Chinese, are forcing people to basically, sell their oil to China in yuan, and Russia and China are doing deals in yuan and rubles, and so slowly the dollar is losing its world reserve status. This is a slow process, but when the system collapses, it becomes a very fast process. There's a great book, by the way, on the Weimar Germany. It's called When Money Fails, and I think the author is Ferguson, so I would encourage people to read that book on Weimar Germany and the failure of the mark at that time, and you can see, when money fails, and this is what we're going to have. When money fails, we are going to see the failure of the paper money system worldwide. And Russia and China are preparing for that failure by accumulating oodles of gold.
Well, Ian, and whenever you look at these economic cycles that you outlined in the first segment, there's really kind of an associated currency cycle where, currency and money start out as being the same thing, where we're actually using gold and silver as money. But then, as time evolves and, we have a pure fiat currency, whether we're talking about the Roman Empire or John Law's France or Weimar Germany, we see, too much of these currencies being created, and then we have these inevitable economic consequences. And it seems like whenever a currency fails, we go back to some type of a gold-based or precious metals-based system. Do you see that happening again?
Absolutely. I mean, the paper money system will fail. As I just said, I think China and Russia are already preparing for that, for a gold-backed system. China doesn't tries to hide the amount of gold that it owns, but it's long been, by people far smarter than I am, have indicated that China has at least 20,000 tons of gold, the Chinese government, and the Chinese people have about 12,000 tons of gold. They legalized the possession by people in China in about 2,000 for people to invest in gold. So, and Russia's been buying gold, multiples of gold as well, so that they're preparing for the collapse of the system. We don't know. The United States purports to have 8,300 tons of gold, but I doubt that that's true. And so it's very difficult to know that when the system collapses, how the United States, how the dollar is going to be backed by gold. But China and Russia will back their currencies with gold.
Ian, very quickly in the time we have left, do you have an opinion on cryptocurrencies? Do you see cryptocurrencies fading, and we're going to be talking about cryptocurrencies like we're reminiscing about a lot of the car companies that failed in the 1920s, or do you think moving ahead cryptocurrencies will have some legitimate place in the economy and in currencies?
I don't really, it's never been my, I don't like things that I don't have control of. And, I can control my ownership in gold and silver. I don't have to, and I do control my ownership in gold and silver. But, I don't, in a cryptocurrency, you don't really have control. It's out there in the ether, the control of it. So I'm not, a great fan of cryptocurrencies. And I really don't believe that they are going to be, are going to be the sort of the mainstay or have any sort of important backing in a monetary system. I really just I can't see it happening.
Well, our guest today has been Mr. Ian Gordon. Ian's website is thelongwavegroup.com. There's a wealth of information there and many years of work and research. I would encourage you to check it out. Ian, always a pleasure to catch up with you. I sure appreciate you joining us today, and would love to have you back down the road.
Well, thank you very much for having me, Dennis.
We will be back after these words.
I am Dennis Tubbergen. You are listening to Retirement Lifestyle Advocates Radio. Glad you're along today, and thanks again to Mr. Ian Gordon for joining us on today's program. Now, in the first segment of today's program, I was talking a bit about an article written by Francesco Brunamonte titled "Central Banks Are Just Getting Warmed Up." And central banks, despite the fact that the Phillips curve, which we talked about in the first segment, is really not working, central banks still enjoy a lot of credibility. You hear among investors things like, never bet against the Fed, or the European Central Bank has the big bazooka primed, and all the market participants monitor each meeting of these bankers to understand what the next policy should be and how they should be positioned when that policy is implemented. Now, central banks meet regularly, and at these meetings, there is really something new that is constantly being discussed. These central bankers are brainstorming to devise ever-new stimulus programs, and as Mr. Brunamonte correctly observes, and I'm quoting from his article, inevitably, the one-off unconventional interventions quickly become the new normal. And we all know that quantitative easing, which is just another word for money printing, That was supposed to be a one-time emergency response to the 2008 crisis. However, when QE stopped and the Fed tried to raise interest rates, the market panicked. And now the Fed has embarked in a new round of QE, or quantitative easing, although the chair of the Fed, Mr. Powell, said, don't call it QE. Now, the bigger point here is that the central banks, as Mr. Brunamonte states in his article, are regularly meeting to try to figure out new, ever more innovative ways to stimulate the world economy. If you consider central bank action since the financial crisis, you'd have to conclude that central banks are increasingly desperate. Now, if you remember 10 years ago, as I just mentioned, when central bankers decided to engage in a program of quantitative easing, also known as money creation out of thin air, and they coupled this quantitative easing with zero interest rates. Now, this was to be a one-time emergency measure that they would never have to use again. And despite the insistence at the time that interest rates would return to more normal levels, it took only a couple rate hikes to throw the financial markets into absolute turmoil. And now look where we are. In addition to negative interest rates, not just zero interest rates, negative interest rates worldwide on $17 trillion plus of sovereign debt, central bankers are continuing their program of quantitative easing. And as I mentioned, Mr. Powell says don't call it quantitative easing. Now, in the last segment, when we talked with Ian Gordon about this issue, the Fed is literally printing $60 billion to $100 billion a day to put into the repo market. So call it what you will, but money creation continues. Now, the repo market, as we talked about in the last segment, is really the overnight and short-term lending market between financial institutions. And this market actually has had some issues in that some of the interest rates overnight have jumped from 2% to 10% simply because some of the banks potentially don't trust loaning money to other banks. So this all suggests that despite more aggressive monetary policy by these central bankers, negative interest rates and money creation are those two aggressive forms of monetary policy, we once again potentially have problems with the financial system. And you have to wonder what money experiment central bankers might try next, and I'm pretty sure that they will come up with something. Now, Mr. Brunamonte points out what you should be concerned about. He stated what I believe, and I certainly agree with him, what the inevitable outcome of such an experiment might be. He said there is today a veritable alphabet soup of monetary policy tools, and he names them, and the result is that no asset class is free of distortion. Let me translate that for you. When no asset class is free of distortion, what Mr. Brunamonte is saying is that it creates bubbles. In his piece, he says this, and I quote, "Chief among these problems are a general hunt for yield in all markets, setting in motion boom and bust cycles, and the inability for pension funds to provide savers with long-term real return to support retirement and future consumption. Far from being problems confined to banks and the ultra-rich, this diverts resources from savers and wealth generators to the politically connected." Now, the reason I bring this up on today's program is simply this. You need to be aware that the behavior of central bankers is not likely to change. History teaches us that it's not likely to change. We are likely going to continue to deal with boom and bust cycles, with each bust making the last bust look light. This means that if central bankers are not likely to change their behavior, you may want to think about changing your investment behavior. I would suggest that you have to have a deflation hedge, stable assets to protect you from boom and bust cycles, and an inflation hedge to protect you from the continuing diminished purchasing power of your savings. And to that end, there's a couple resources that I will draw your attention to. You can go to retirementlifestyleadvocates.com, and on that website, you can download any podcast of this program that you'd like. You can also get a free subscription to our weekly newsletter titled Portfolio Watch, where we keep you apprised as to what our perspective is as to what's going on the economy and in the financial markets. And you can also go to socialsecuritydinner.com, and that site is a little bit misleading in that we not only talk about maximizing Social Security, but also these issues of protecting yourself as well as saving taxes. Information on our upcoming meetings at socialsecuritydinner.com. Thanks for tuning in today. I'll be back again next week.